Would you believe a dog once did something in a courtroom that made a decorated judge cry in front of an entire audience? It didn't bark, it didn't growl, it didn't even move from its place beside a wheelchair, yet in that stillness, it spoke louder than anyone else in the room ever could. And what happened next left even the toughest soldiers in tears. So if you're watching this right now, take a breath, settle in, and don't look away, because this story will stay with you long after the video ends. And before we go on, tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it over there? I'd love to know who's here listening to this moment with us, because this is not just a story about war or loss or duty. It's a story about something most people don't understand until they've lived it. The silent, unbreakable bond between a soldier and the dog that carried his soul when his own strength couldn't. And his name was Matthew Cole, a name you wouldn't know unless you were part of his unit, unless you saw him in the dust of Kandahar, unless you watched him lift his best friend into a chopper with smoke behind him and blood on his sleeves. But before he was a soldier, he was just a kid from Ohio, the kind that grew up barefoot in backyards with muddy jeans and skinned elbows, the kind that always had a dog around. Some mutt or shepherd mix following him home from school, sleeping at the foot of his bed, always there like some promise. Only kids and dogs truly believe in, and when 9/11s happened, he was only 8. But the image stayed in his head like a brand, and by the time he turned 18, he walked into the recruiter's office and said he wanted to serve, not because he was fearless, but because he was terrified of a world where people didn't show up when others needed them most, and that was how he ended up in uniform. Rifle slung over his shoulder, boots too stiff on his first deployment, heart too big for the weight it would carry, and then there was Ranger, not his first dog, not even his, really, but a canine partner assigned to him during his second tour, a German shepherd with eyes that seemed to read souls, trained for detection, loyal to command, but more than that, loyal to Matthew even before either of them realized it, and in a place where noise could mean death and silence could mean survival. They learned to breathe together, move together, trust each other without words, and when the explosion happened, when the dirt swallowed them and time slowed and the world tipped on its axis, it wasn't the medics who found him first. It was Ranger, barking once, dragging debris with teeth and paws until help came, even after the blast took Matthew's legs. Even after he was airlifted back to the States, strapped to a gurney with machines humming, it was Ranger's whine that he heard through the haze. And later, through months of surgeries and therapy and cold sweat nightmares, it was Ranger's head on his chest that kept him breathing, even when he didn't want to, but military rules were clear. K-9 South were reassigned after service. They didn't get to retire with their handlers. And Matthew, despite medals and scars and a chest full of memories, was told Ranger would be sent to a new unit deployed again, no different than a weapon being passed from hand to hand. But to Matthew, he wasn't a weapon. He was the reason his heart still beat. And so he fought, filed forms, wrote letters, begged the system to see him not as a number, but as a man whose soul had already been split once by war, and couldn't take losing the only piece that held him together. But bureaucracy doesn't bend for emotion, and on the morning of the hearing, the judge was set to give the final verdict. Matthew rolled into that courtroom with his uniform pressed, hand shaking, heart thundering, and Ranger beside him, wearing his service vest. In a calmness that made the entire gallery go silent. And what happened next? The way Ranger moved, the way Matthew fell to his knees, the way strangers gasped and soldiers rose from their seats, that moment would make headlines. But what led up to it? What built that silence? What made a hardened man whisper, "I'm not ready to say goodbye"? That is what we're here to tell. And if you've ever loved a dog, if you've ever known what it's like to be understood without a single word, then stay with me, because this is just the beginning of what became one of the most emotional court cases in military canine history. The room was warm, but Matthew felt cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from air conditioning or a breeze slipping through a crack in the wall, but the kind of cold that settles deep inside your chest when you're about to lose something that kept you alive, something that never asked for anything except to be near you. And that morning, when the nurse had wheeled him out of the hospital van and into the courthouse parking lot, he didn't speak. He didn't even look around, because in his lap was Ranger's leash coiled like a rope around his fingers. And to let it go would be like pulling a plug on a memory he wasn't ready to live without. Ranger, sensing that weight, didn't pull or pace or sniff the ground like other dogs might have. He sat perfectly still, his ears high, eyes forward. Every inch of him focused on the man beside him, as if he already understood what was at stake. And when they entered the building, people turned. Not because they hadn't seen a soldier before, or a dog, or even a man in a wheelchair, but because the silence that surrounded them was unlike anything else that day. It wasn't tense or angry or loud with unspoken questions. It was reverent, quiet like a church when you walk in after a storm, and when they passed the security checkpoint. One guard who'd served a tours himself reached for his cap and pressed it to his chest. And Matthew nodded once, not out of pride, but because he had nothing else to give in that moment. And every step, every hallway, every creak of the wheels on that chair echoed like drum beats, leading him closer to something he didn't want to face. And when the doors opened and the courtroom came into view, he saw the faces, rows and rows of them, some in uniform, some in plain clothes, some reporters, some family members of veterans, and a few who had simply heard there was going to be a military dog hearing and came to show support. But no one clapped, no one whispered, no one even blinked when Ranger walked. Beside him, down the center aisle, the dog's head held high, tail still, vest gleaming with the word Army stitched across the side, and for a brief second, Matthew felt the lump in his throat rise so hard he thought he might cry right then and there. But he didn't. He gripped. The wheels moved forward and took his place by the defense table. And behind him sat his old commanding officer, a man named Foster, who'd flown in from another state just to testify. And on the prosecution side was a young military legal rep, maybe 26, no combat time. Just doing her job, trying to follow the law as it was written, not as it was lived. And when the judge entered, the room rose, but Matthew couldn't, so he did something else. Something that made the whole gallery pause. He reached over and rested his hand on Ranger's shoulder. And the dog didn't move, but the gesture said everything. It said respect. It said I'm still standing, even if I'm sitting. And it said this moment matters more than you know. And the judge, a stern woman in her 60s, with lines around her mouth, like they'd been carved by 1,000 stories she'd heard over decades, looked at Matthew for a long time before she spoke. And when she did, it wasn't the cold voice of protocol. It was the voice of someone who'd lost people, who'd maybe even loved a dog herself once. And she asked very softly, "Sergeant Cole, would you like to begin with a statement?" And Matthew nodded, cleared his throat, and tried to speak. But nothing came, not right away. Because how do you summarize years of war, explosions, surgeries, night sweats, morphine, silence, trauma, and the one creature who never left your side, into a few sentences? So he didn't try to be eloquent. He just said, "I don't sleep without him. I don't walk without him. I don't talk to anyone else the way I talk to him. And maybe that sounds silly, but he knows when I'm about to fall apart before I do. And I know that if you take him from me, I'll break. I won't make it through the next year. I won't make it through the next month." And at that, someone in the back sniffled. Maybe a spouse of a soldier. Maybe a mother. Maybe just someone who knew grief when they heard it, and the judge nodded. Once, her eyes unreadable, and turned to the military attorney, who stood and began citing regulations, code numbers, the necessity of keeping active K9 South in rotation, how adopting out combat-trained dogs was rare, dangerous, and discouraged unless there were extenuating circumstances. And when she said the words, "No evidence suggests this handler cannot live without this dog," Ranger did something no one expected. He stood, calmly walked to the center of the room, turned, and sat in front of the attorney, not barking, not growling, not wagging, just sitting, looking directly into her eyes as if to say, "I am not a machine. I am not a tool. I am here for him." And at that moment, you could have heard a pin drop, the kind of silence that wraps around your ears and presses against your heart. And slowly, one by one, the soldiers in the back of the room began to stand, not saying anything, not holding signs, just standing, and behind them, their family members, nurses, neighbors, people who'd known other dogs like Ranger, and even the young lawyer hesitated, her mouth open slightly, her paper trembling in her hand. Because in that courtroom, facts no longer mattered. Regulations no longer held weight. What mattered was the man in the wheelchair and the dog who never left him. And somewhere in the middle of that stillness, Matthew whispered, "He's my legs now, and my alarm clock, and my tether to this world. If you send him away, I don't know who I'll become." And with that, the judge closed her notebook, leaned forward, and said, "I need a recess," and stepped down from the bench, not to escape, but because even she had tears in her eyes, and as the room slowly breathed again, Matthew lowered his head, Ranger curled beside him. And no one moved, because they all knew this wasn't just about a dog, it was about something bigger, something deeper, something only those who've walked through hell together could understand. The recess lasted only 20 minutes, but to Matthew, it stretched like a quiet eternity. And not the peaceful kind, but the kind where your thoughts spiral louder than any courtroom whisper, louder than any pain you've known, because in that moment he wasn't just a soldier waiting on a decision. He was a man clutching the last piece of himself that war hadn't taken. And across from him, Ranger lay quietly, his head resting between his paws, his ears relaxed but alert, eyes flicking up every few seconds to scan the door, as if he already knew that the answer waiting on the other side of that hallway could change everything. And around them, people shuffled gently, murmuring in low voices, not out of disrespect, but because they knew they were witnessing something sacred. And a few even walked up quietly to lay a hand on Matthew's shoulder, or whispered that they were praying for him. Not all of them knew him, not all of them had ever served, but they understood love. They understood what it looked like when someone refused to let go, and when the judge finally returned, her robe trailing slightly, her eyes soft but unreadable. Everyone in the courtroom instinctively rose again, except Matthew, who sat straighter in his chair, his hands folded in his lap, and the leash still wrapped loosely around his wrists like a lifeline. And when she sat down, she took a moment before speaking, long enough that even the air in the room seemed to wait with bated breath, and finally she said, "Before I give my decision, I want to allow one last testimony." And from the corner of the room, a door opened, and in walked an older man with a limp, his uniform slightly faded, his hair salt and pepper, and Matthew's breath caught because he hadn't seen this man in nearly 6 years, not since the blast, not since that dusty morning when they'd pulled Ranger and Matthew out of the debris. And the man walked slowly but with purpose, his cane clicking lightly on the floor. And as he reached the stand, he turned to the judge and said, "Permission to speak freely, Your Honor." And when she nodded, he didn't waste time with formalities. He looked straight at Matthew and said, "I was there that day. I was in the convoy behind Sergeant Cole's unit, and when the explosion happened, we thought we'd lost them all. But then we heard barking, not wild barking, not panicked, but rhythmic, sharp, like a signal. And when we followed it, we found the dog digging with everything he had, pulling at Matthew's vest, dragging him out inch by inch. And I'm telling you, Judge, if that dog hadn't been there, Matthew wouldn't be sitting here. And that's not speculation, that's fact." And then he turned, pointed at Ranger and added, "I've seen a lot in my years, but I've never seen loyalty like that, and it doesn't end on the battlefield. It stays, long after the bullets stop flying. It stays in the silence of night when a man wakes up screaming. It stays when he doesn't eat, doesn't move, when the pain gets louder than his will. That dog right there, he's not just a companion. He's the only reason, Sergeant. Cole is still alive. And that's something no reassignment form or regulation can measure." And when he sat down, the courtroom was quiet again. Not out of obligation, but because they all knew there was no more that needed to be said. And the judge looked down for a long moment, flipping through her notes, her pen tapping lightly against the desk, and then, without warning, she said, "Ranger, come here." And the room collectively inhaled, unsure of what would happen next, but Ranger didn't hesitate. He stood, walked calmly to the bench, and sat down right in front of her, looking up with those deep, soulful eyes that had seen war. Grief, pain, and healing, and the judge looked down at him and whispered, "You know your person, don't you?" And Ranger blinked once, his tail thumped once, and she nodded as if he had answered. And then she looked at Matthew and said, "Sergeant Cole, you've served this country with honor. You've endured things most of us cannot imagine. And while I am bound by laws, I am also guided by humanity. And in this case, I believe humanity must prevail. Therefore, I am granting full adoption rights to you for Ranger." Effective immediately, and the courtroom exploded, not in noise, but in emotion. People wept, people gasped, some hugged each other, others covered their mouths, and Matthew just sat there, eyes wide, chest heaving, hands trembling as he reached for Ranger, who trotted back and placed his front paws on the wheelchair's footrests, nuzzling his head into Matthew's lap as if to say, "It's okay, we're safe now." And in that moment, it didn't matter what rank he held, how many medals lined his drawer, how many scars etched his body. What mattered was that he was whole again, and across the room, the young attorney wiped at her eyes, unable to hide the lump in her throat, and even the judge looked away briefly, blinking faster than usual. And as the crowd slowly rose to their feet, offering a quiet, spontaneous standing ovation, Matthew turned to Ranger and whispered, "We did it, buddy. We're going home," and that single moment, that quiet vow between man and dog, would be shared across the country, turned into news clips, social media posts, and documentaries. But none of those could ever truly capture what it felt like in that courtroom when love defeated regulation. When loyalty broke through red tape. When a soldier who had lost so much was finally allowed to keep the one thing that brought him back. And as they wheeled out into the sunlight, surrounded by people clapping and saluting, Ranger walking close, proud and calm, Matthew didn't feel like a broken man anymore. He felt like someone whole, someone alive. And as he looked up into the sky, he whispered to no one in particular, "Thank you," because he knew this was more than a victory. This was a homecoming. The drive home wasn't long, but it felt like crossing an ocean, not in distance, but in what it represented. Because for the first time in nearly a year, Matthew sat beside Ranger not as patient and property of the military, but as family. No more red tape, no more looming transfer orders. Just two souls bound together by something deeper than war, something even time couldn't undo. And as they pulled into the modest house, nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in their small Ohio town, neighbors stepped out of their homes, some waving, some clapping, a few holding signs that said "Welcome home." Ranger with little paw prints drawn in Sharpie, and Matthew couldn't stop the tears this time. He didn't try. Because this wasn't the kind of homecoming parade. With fanfare and marching bands, this was something quieter, purer, where people didn't need medals or speeches to show they cared. And Ranger, ever composed, sat tall beside the front gate, letting kids pet his fur, letting elderly neighbors run gentle hands along his vest. And inside the house, nothing had changed. The couch was still a little too firm, the kitchen still smelled like coffee and dust, and the guest room was still filled with unopened boxes from before the deployment. But for Matthew, everything felt new, even the silence, even the creak of the wood beneath his wheels. And that night, for the first time in months, he slept without pills, without tossing, without waking to the echoes of screaming sand and flashing gunfire, because Ranger slept curled up at the foot of the bed, breathing steady, like a heartbeat that never left. And in the morning, something strange happened. Something neither of them could have anticipated. A knock on the door, not forceful, but curious. And when Matthew opened it, he was met with the lens of a local reporter's camera and a soft-spoken woman holding a notepad, asking if she could talk to the man who changed a courtroom's heart. And at first, Matthew hesitated, not because he didn't want to share, but because he didn't think anyone would care beyond the people who were there. But when the article came out 2 days later, titled "The Soldier, the Dog, and the Day the Rules Bent for Love," everything changed. Phone calls came in from veterans organizations, animal advocacy groups, even lawmakers who said the story sparked conversations about rewriting policies for military K-9 retirement. And one morning, Matthew sat staring at his old prosthetic limbs leaning against the wall, collecting dust, and thought, maybe I can do more, not just for me, but for the others who never got their dogs back, for the men and women who lost their partners and never had a chance to say goodbye. And so he made a decision, quiet but fierce, to speak, to tell their story again and again, in schools, at town halls, on podcasts, not for fame, but because he realized something powerful. People didn't need to experience war to understand loyalty. They just needed to hear about it. From someone who'd lived it, and every time he spoke, Ranger was there, sitting beside him, calm, watchful, occasionally letting out a soft huff when someone clapped too loud or leaned in too close. And with every talk, every story, more people began to listen, really listen, and then came the letter from Washington, inviting him to testify before a subcommittee discussing proposed reforms to military working dog legislation. And Matthew, who had once doubted whether his voice mattered outside a battlefield, now found himself standing before a panel of officials in a dark suit, his medals pinned neatly, Ranger at his heel. And he spoke not with rehearsed lines or anger, but with calm truth, painting vivid pictures of what it meant to trust an animal with your life, what it meant to come home and not be allowed to bring the one soul that kept you sane. And by the end of that session, 3 senators had tears in their eyes, and one quietly whispered to his aide, "We need to change this." And that night, back in the hotel room, Matthew sat on the floor beside Ranger, running his fingers through the thick fur and whispering, "Buddy, I think we're making a difference." Ranger, as always, didn't reply, but simply rested his head on Matthew's knee, and in that silence, there was peace. And as the months passed, stories began pouring in from other handlers, from widows, from children who remembered the dog their father once served with. And one day, during a quiet Saturday breakfast, Matthew got a call from a woman in Texas whose husband had passed the previous year. And she told him she still had the dog, still had the vest, but no one had ever asked about them. And would he be willing to help her find a way to donate the vest to a memorial project he'd mentioned in an interview? And that's when the idea took root. Slowly at first, like a seed beneath winter soil. But it grew, and within a few months, Matthew had raised enough to open a small nonprofit called Home After Duty, a place where veterans could apply to keep their canine south after service, where retired military dogs could find permanent homes with those who understood their training and trauma. And the first event they held wasn't flashy, just a gathering in a local park with flags and folding chairs, but 50 people showed up, and 12 dogs, and there was laughter, stories, and the kind of quiet hugs only soldiers give. And that night, when Matthew and Ranger sat beneath the stars, watching as families packed up and volunteers cleaned the tables, Matthew whispered, "I thought the court case was the end, but I think this is just the beginning." And Ranger let out a low, soft sound, something between a sigh and a growl. Matthew smiled, because in that sound was agreement, in that moment was legacy. And he didn't know then that something even bigger was coming, something no one saw coming, not even him, and that it would begin with a letter that arrived on a stormy evening, sealed in gold, bearing a crest he hadn't seen since the day he left the service. And when he opened it, the words inside made his heart skip. Because it wasn't just about Ranger, it was about something deeper, something buried, something that was about to change their lives again. The letter came on a Thursday evening, delivered not by the usual mail truck, but by a clean black sedan with government plates, the kind Matthew hadn't seen in years. And when he wheeled up to the porch, still wearing the soft hoodie Ranger had chewed holes through in 3 different places, he saw the envelope sitting on the welcome mat, heavy parchment, golden seal. His full name typed in elegant lettering on the front, not just Sergeant Matthew Cole, but Staff Sergeant Matthew E. Cole, U.S. Army Ret. And as he picked it up, something inside him shifted. It's that old stirring in his chest like the night before deployment. Not fear exactly, but that sense that something was beginning. And when he tore the seal open, careful not to let Ranger nose it off the porch in excitement, he unfolded the thick paper and read the words slowly. Then again, because his eyes were suddenly clouded with emotion. And by the third read, he was gripping the letter tight, whispering aloud, "Are you seeing this, buddy?" Because what the letter said was simple and monumental all at once. It was an invitation from the Pentagon. A formal request asking Matthew and Ranger to represent all K9 combat veterans in a national ceremony recognizing retired military dogs for their service. The first of its kind in the country, with statues to be unveiled, stories to be read aloud. As the final line said, lives to be honored that could never be replaced. And for a long moment, Matthew just sat there on the porch, steps, with the sky glowing pink behind him, and the sound of Ranger's tail thumping against the wood. And he didn't think about the pain, the surgeries, the lost years. He thought about that dusty morning in Kandahar, the moment Ranger pulled him from the debris, the sound of barking that had become his lifeline, and the look in Ranger's eyes that never changed, not once. And so, when the day came, they dressed in full regalia, Matthew in his uniform, freshly pressed, medals gleaming, and Ranger in a new vest embroidered with the words "Retired, but forever ready." And as they arrived at the event, held on the steps of the National Mall beneath the giant flag that never stopped moving, the crowd grew quiet. Not out of obligation, but because they understood what was happening, and when Matthew took the podium, Ranger by his side, the silence was absolute. And he didn't read from a paper, didn't rehearse a speech, he just told them the truth about what it's like to wake up every night to screaming memories, and have a dog place his head on your chest until your breathing slows. What it's like to lose friends in seconds and have a pair of eyes look up at you like you're still worth saving. What it's like to be broken in places the world can't see and have four paws keep you grounded on the worst days. And by the time he stepped down, the entire crowd stood in silent applause. Veterans saluting, kids wiping tears. A nation paying tribute to the quiet heroes with fur and eyes that never looked away. And later that night, under the stars once more, Matthew and Ranger stood before the unveiled statue, a life-size bronze figure of a soldier in combat gear, kneeling, one hand on the head of a German shepherd, their eyes locked forever in that moment of trust, and Matthew reached out and touched the dog's statue muzzle, whispering, "They finally see you, buddy. They finally see what you've always been." And just then, something remarkable happened. Ranger sat down, looked up at him, and lifted his paw, placing it gently on Matthew's leg, and though he'd done that 1,000 times before, something in this moment felt different. Final, not in a sad way, but in the way a sunset knows when to take its bow. And for the first time, Matthew felt peace, real peace. Not because he had closure, but because he had purpose. And over the next few years, they did it all. Visited schools, helped new veterans, raised funds for shelters, reunited other dogs with handlers, even pushed legislation through Congress to create a national registry for all military K9 South to ensure they'd never be lost in bureaucracy again. And as Ranger aged, graying around the muzzle, moving a little slower, needing more naps than usual, Matthew didn't panic, didn't rush. He just cherished it all, every lazy morning on the porch, every slow walk to the mailbox, every time Ranger laid his head on his foot while he read letters from soldiers around the country. And one spring morning, after a long, peaceful night, Ranger didn't wake, not in fear, not in pain, but in perfect calm, curled up at the foot of Matthew's bed just like always. And when Matthew realized it, he didn't scream. He didn't fall apart. He just knelt, placed his forehead against Ranger's and whispered, "You did it, buddy. You got me here. You brought me all the way home." And the world mourned with him. Thousands of messages poured in, stories, letters, photos of dogs in service vests, watching videos of Ranger. And even the White House sent a tribute. But Matthew knew, deep down, that Ranger wasn't gone. Not really. He was in every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of courage that lived on in the dogs and soldiers they'd helped. And years later, when a new recruit stood at a podium, trembling slightly, telling a crowd about the first time he met a man who showed him how to live with the memories, he said something that echoed through the auditorium. He told me his dog saved him. And now, I believe mine will save me too. And in the back row, an older man with a cane and silver hair nodded quietly, his eyes full but clear. Because Matthew Cole knew that legacies don't end when the dog sleeps. They begin when someone else wakes up with hope. And as the lights dimmed and the national anthem played, the bronze statue at the entrance caught the glow of a single spotlight. Soldier and the dog, forever frozen in that moment of goodbye that never really was. And a plaque beneath it read, "He was more than a dog. He was the piece that made me whole." And to anyone walking by, it was just a quote. But to those who knew, who served, who loved a dog like Ranger, it meant everything.